Kermie Bledsoe, who is an intelligence analyst for the FBI's Cyber Division, Critical Infrastructure Intelligence and Engagement Unit. He works mainly on the unit's energy sector team and provides strategic analysis on cyber threats to the energy sector and its subsectors. He has 13 years of analytical experience working on things such as trend-based analysis using multiple intelligence disciplines and methods. He's joined by Gabriel Maxwell, who's been with the FBI since 2002. He has worked in human trafficking, counterintelligence, and cyber. He's a Supervisory Special Agent, so everyone salute him. And he's lectured extensively for the George C. Marshall Center for Security Studies in Germany. And in 2019, he was selected as a special assistant to the assistant director, where he represented the FBI cyber policy interests at the Department of Justice, the National Security Council, the Pentagon, and the White House. Gentlemen, over to you, and I look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. It's really our pleasure to be here. And the first thing I want to make an observation of is we seem like we're really far away from you guys in the screen, and we don't have a fish tank, unfortunately. But Kermie's going to work with me to help, kind of recruit someone in the FBI to help us get a fish tank in here, so we have a little bit better,
decoration.
A little better landscape. A few things I wanted to talk to you guys about today, and I think that it's fundamental in this whole process of how do we work better as government agencies with private sector. And at a very high level, what are some lessons we've learned as the FBI and private sector over time that we've been working on this particular issue? How do we support information sharing from government agency to government agency and government agency to private sector? What's the scope of that information sharing? And then lastly, some challenges. Again, we'll just keep this high level, and I'm really looking forward to just having conversation and dialogue when we're done here. I want you to think about what we're doing today is really as a conversation with you on where we stand and maybe how we do business. The first thing I'll say is we're in this constant evolution of learning. Cyber is an ever expanding, linear and horizontally and vertically process. And as we go along, we learn new things and we learn new ways to adapt and adjust to the threat and the problem. As we get into start talking about some of the big cyber lessons, I want to just kind of lay the framework of the FBI briefly. We're a unique organization in that we're structured. If you think about us, we're kind of split in two pieces. The criminal side, which would be the typical criminal things that you think happen, from bank robberies to just regular crimes, and into national security, nation state types of things that we look at, investigate, try to assign attribution to, prosecute, those sorts of things. Cyber kind of straddles both of those lines, so we're unique in that way. Historically, the FBI, in its process of investigation, we've always been very protective of cases that we're working. And so because of that, we haven't been the greatest sharers of information. We're trying to protect a case, get it to prosecution, hold a bad guy accountable, or in a national security sphere, how do we run operations and investigations in a way that will help advance the mission of the FBI further? How do we get information into policy makers' hands, lawmakers' hands, so that they have broader leverage and influence across the globe when they're talking with international partners and those sorts of things? So we're in this unique position, and we haven't always been great at, I would say, information sharing. Cyber, as it came of age, changed all of that. And so this gets at some of the core components for us, right, in terms of information sharing. First, we see cyber as the ultimate team sport, and that language started making its way into FBI terminology probably 4 or 5 years ago. Although we thought about it that way, we really didn't start putting it into practice until recently. And when I say it's the ultimate team sport, kind of here's what I'm getting at with that. a lot of the landscape, as you know, is owned by the private sector. So if we're going to action something that's germane to the government, germane to the FBI, germane to operations or investigations, we need the cooperation and the collaboration, is probably a better word, of private sector. And so we started to realize it can't be a one-way street. In other words, we can't ask private sector and corporations to help us and then us in return not have something to give them back. So we started working with other government agencies and private sector to action ways that we could do that better, that we're getting away from this old FBI model that once we get information, it gets locked up in this sort of thing and we never share. So we really started advancing that notion of how do we share information broadly. And we do that in a couple of ways. I'd like to share some of those with you. One of the programs that the Bureau has run for some years, it started before cyber, is our InfraGard program. So private sector parties can sign up to be members of InfraGard. And it's just a loose kind of affiliation, if you will. Now it's a little more formalized, but that InfraGard membership gives you access to FBI information, and it gives you access to FBI personnel in field offices. Part of the idea was to formulate relationships in local field offices. Let me pause there because I think it's this important concept to talk about. We're distributed, the FBI is distributed across the United States in major cities, which we call field offices. There's headquarters in DC and then major field offices. We also have extensions across the globe internationally in embassies. We call our ALAT or LEGAT program, where we have cyber agents positioned at critical places that we think are important to the United States interests and how we can cooperate. So when we talk about field offices, ultimately part of the goal with the InfraGard program is to put agents and analysts and FBI personnel in close touch and in close relationship with private sector partners, so that when something happens, those private sector partners aren't thinking, I got to call some guy in Washington, D.C. I'm going to call Gabe in Washington, D.C. And you've never met me and you've never seen me. Rather, you could turn and say, I'm going to call Kermie, who's sitting in San Antonio, Texas. He's my local guy that I'm going to talk to. He's not really in San Antonio. He's here, but that's the example, right? So that's one of the things we started doing. The other thing the government does, I think that is fairly effective, is there's 7 federal cyber centers across the United States. And just to give you a sampling of what those are, there's one here, we're sitting where one of those cyber centers is, the NCIJTF. It's a National Joint Cyber Investigative Task Force. So inside that task force, a lot of agencies, government agencies sit, to include Department of Energy staff and other components. But inside that task force is a 24/7 watch center. CISA, or Department of Homeland Security, has one. Department of Defense has one. And so every day, a couple of times a day, we sync on a telephone call of what are the things you're seeing across your landscape. So if we're positioned inward to the US government and also positioned outward to private sector, we'd like to think that we kind of sit in the middle to be able to pass information back and forth. So if CISA or DHS has something that's germane or relevant to a private sector entity, we're able to kind of pass that on. That's how that sort of cooperation and collaboration started in the cyber centers. It's maturated to a place now where anyone in a cyber center or any critical infrastructure entity can initiate contact with each other electronically. So we have a system where you can go in and put, hey, here's a new ransomware attack that's affected transportation sector. That program will then carve out the targeted entity. I'll use that name instead of victim, and we'll talk about one of the challenges is language that is used. That target entity name, we carve out that name and share the selectors, especially if we think that those selectors might be important to, I don't know, pipelines, or might be important to energy, or might be important somewhere else, right? So we're trying to share that information as broadly as we can, as quickly as we can in some of this automated process. So that's another mechanism that we've started to work toward. How do you share information externally and then internally with the United States government? One of the other, I think, innovative things that's unfolding now is it's called the OT Defender Fellowship, and that's really led by Department of Energy and Congress and another private sector company. So some years ago, the U.S. government at congressional level said, hey, we're not doing a good enough job in cyber. So they got all these heads of agencies together. And one of the gaps that we discovered in this process was there's a definite gap between the OT side, operational technology side, and the IT side of critical infrastructure, especially when it involves industrial control systems. So that program selected fellows. So anyone in the private sector could raise their hand that was part of these ICS organizations, private sector organizations, and say, hey, I would like to be a fellow. And so the first iteration of fellows had 2021 just made their way through a little more than a year's fellowship program. They get together with government agencies. They learn about how government agencies operate. They learn about how we share information. They learn about the intelligence cycle, which was really good, Matt. Thanks for putting that up there. Sorry, it's Shaun. And then they get to come to DC and meet with us. So for that first iteration that I had of the fellows, we went to Quantico, which is our training academy. They got a tour of the facility, and then they had a series of briefs from the FBI. Here's how we process information. Here's how we would process information if you gave it to us. Here's how we would share it to other government agencies. So you're only having to share information one time. And then here's what you can expect back from us to help you with that. So I think it's important. Let me just pause there for a second, because the thing that's critical with all of this is just communication, right? That we're trying to develop relationships and have communication on, one, how we do it, and then who we are, so that when something happens, it's not this mystery, right? And so we've worked really hard to explain to private sector partners how it is that we do business, and then ask them simultaneously, if you have an event, how do you want us to respond to you? What can we do for you now before an event happens? Just putting those components together. So they spent some time with us at Quantico, and then they got a whole bunch of briefs from us, some classified briefs. And then as they went back to their hometowns, I connected them with ICS related contacts in their hometown, right? So again, this is just that outreach component where we're trying to think about what we're doing in the space as not necessarily when it happens, call us. It's how do we maintain a constant relationship with one another over day in and day out. The other thing that we have is a cyber task force. Every field office that I mentioned, there's a cyber task force there, and that cyber task force is connected to state and local cyber officers, and they're also faced outward to what we call domain entities. So what companies in our domain, in our area, have information that is relevant to the United States government if there's an investigation or there's a case, and then how do we establish a relationship with them before something happens? Again, this gets back to the communication and relationship building for us.
If I could, sorry, briefly interrupt there. If you could leave the audience with one key takeaway, one buzz sentence, if you like, what would it be?
That relationships are the most important component. Relationships are key to everything. And if you have an understanding of what each other's missions and goals are, that the relationship will drive the rest of that train.
Excellent. Gentlemen, sorry to stop you at that point.
No, not me.
We have one more speaker. We have one more speaker, and then we'll go into the Q&A session, if that's okay. So thank you both. It's very interesting. I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions in the panel discussion.